This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. So I finally finished Final Fantasy XVI a couple weeks ago. I feel like the dust has kind of settled on all the hot takes about it. Like most Final Fantasy games, this one experiments with the formula. It hits in some areas and misses in other ones that I wasn't expecting. So let's get into it.
I'll tear you apart with my bare hands!
Try it.
Now die!
Welcome back to JBG. Today we're talking about Final Fantasy XVI on the PS5. I've been playing Final Fantasy games since the 90s.
I'm old. Been around a while, been doing this a bit.
So you could say I'm a pretty big fan of the franchise. This franchise has always been known for experimentation, and this one might be the biggest departure for a mainline single-player entry from the Final Fantasy roots. I'll say up front that I really liked it overall, but this is definitely not going to be for everybody, and I'm going to go over a few of the reasons here. As usual, I'm going to try and keep the spoilers to a minimum, but I will be spoiling some early game content and touching on a few mid-game mechanics. And while I had a major plot point spoiled for me through context watching a video during my playthrough, I'm going to do my best to screen the footage for contextual spoilers, but it's still possible I missed something, so here's your warning. Like most Final Fantasy games outside of direct sequels, this game's story is fully independent of any of the other games in the series. The story opens up with some time jumps for narrative reasons, but the gist of it is you're playing as young Clive Rosfield, the older prince to the kingdom of Rosaria. You're training to become a shield, or a protector, for your younger brother Joshua, who's the dominant of fire, and the icon Phoenix. But we'll circle back to that in a second. Not going too deep into it, Clive was expected to be the Phoenix dominant as the firstborn, and the fact it's skipped in for his younger brother gives some character motives for how the first act plays out. During the opening, you're also introduced to your childhood friend Jill, and your parents, the Archduke Elwyn and Empress Annabella. It shows the family dynamic pretty well in the first few scenes, showing the disappointment of Annabella in Clive not being the dominant and just being a bearer.
And I doubt that she gave you the stink eye. That's just the way her face looks, that's just her face.
So a dominant is someone who can harness the power of the icons, what traditionally are referred to as summons in Final Fantasy games. Phoenix, Shiva, Odin, Ifrit. And yes, I know this installment pronounces it Ifrit.
Not gonna say it.
But I've been saying Ifrit since the 90s, so I'm sticking with it. So while dominants harness the power of the icons, there are also what are called bearers. Bearers are people blessed with some of the power of the icons, but not enough of the power to transform into the actual icon form like the dominants. Most of this world looks down on them as second-class citizens, and they're often enslaved and used for their magic powers and are even branded for recognition. From using bearers, along with magic shards of the Mother Crystal, people have become accustomed to using magic in everyday life. Clive is a bearer blessed with some of the power of Phoenix, at least at the beginning of the story. In an attempt to awaken Joshua's full dominant abilities, the story takes you to Phoenix Gate. This is an ancient structure only known to be tied to the power of the dominants. Once there, they're attacked and Elwyn is killed right in front of Joshua. His rage awakens his powers to fully transform into the Phoenix. But at the same time, the Phoenix is attacked by another dominant of fire, Ifrit. This opens up another mystery as there shouldn't be multiple dominants of the same element. During the fight, Ifrit kills Phoenix, and you snap back to the present time 13 years later. Clive has been marked as a bearer and was sold into slavery after the fall of his kingdom at the Phoenix Gate. He's now a slave to the Imperial Army working for an elite unit hunting down dominants. You're chasing down the dominant of Shiva when you realize the icon dominant you're actually hunting is your childhood friend Jill. Naturally, you defect to protect your childhood friend, and you're introduced to Sid, the dominant of Ramuh, which happens to have the same dog that you and Jill had 13 years ago, because video games. Just gonna say really quick, Sid is a recurring character in most mainline Final Fantasy games, but this Sid has to be the best iteration of him.
Well, not by choice, mind. Old bloody Rome of strapping young lads. And it was this sorry sack of bones Ramuh saw fit to home.
Sid is a revolutionary looking to free the bearers from slavery, and later explains that he plans on taking down the Mother Crystals providing all the magic power to the world, as he thinks they're causing the blight that is spreading across the lands, basically sucking all life out of the countries. Here's where the early game predictable spoilers come in. It was completely obvious from the flashback sequence that Clive was the dominant Ifrit. I think intentionally, but the story takes its time for Clive to realize it himself. So while he's been planning his revenge on the second dominant of fire for 13 years, it's stretched out for a few hours before he realizes it. But since he's actually been chasing another dominant this whole time, Sid and Jill set out to help him find the other dominant and get some answers. This story takes a much more mature tone than you're used to in a Final Fantasy game. Even seeing blood and hearing F-bombs rattle off was a bit jarring at first.
Gav!
Don't tell me there's more of the
But I have to say, with some of the negatives I'm going to talk about in a few, the main story kept me hooked on this game all the way through the end. This was actually a detriment to the side quest towards the end, because I just wanted to skip them and get back to the main story. There were comparisons to Game of Thrones made here, and at first I dismissed them since Final Fantasy stories almost always consist of warring kingdoms. But the longer I played, the more I'd have to agree. It gets pretty convoluted before refocusing on the big bad in the last act, but there's help with that too. So let's talk about the mechanics. The touchpad, whether in regular gameplay or even cutscenes, brings up the active time lower menu. This menu should be a mandatory addition for every single-player story-driven game in the future. I know there's a lot of extra dev effort to put this menu in and expand it as the story goes on, but as someone who sometimes has to go a couple weeks without playing something, this was an absolute amazing addition. Hopping back into the game really only took a few minutes to get spun back up to where we were at in the story. It kept me invested since I wasn't just trying to remember what was going on the last time I played however long ago. This is a feature that can be completely ignored, but as a quality of life feature, I'm not sure I've ever been so happy with something like this as it's implemented. Now onto the combat. There are a lot of hot takes on the combat among everything else, so here's my take on it. They really did away with the turn-based in Final Fantasy 15, and here the combat hits even more on an action game target. I wouldn't be so reductive to call it a hack and slash exactly, but it's definitely meant to streamline the combat to be approachable. It resembles the Devil May Cry franchise for obvious reasons. The combat director for DMC5 worked on the combat here. Now they took more steps to approachability than I would have liked in some areas, mainly having easy mode accessories that will turn it into a true button masher for those less adept at action games. This literally removes the need to time a lot of the combat actions, making the dodging mechanic way too easy to use, and can even automatically insert your skills into your combos, taking all the fun out of the combat in an action game. Now this is a choice to make as a player, but the combat itself is just a bit too forgiving for me. Now it starts really basic with your dodge, quick step, attack, and magic attack. But as your icon skills build, so do your options in combat, and the further you build up the icon skills, the more I found the combat a bit too forgiving. I only died in one battle that wasn't a boss fight, and this was more me just not paying attention as opposed to actual difficulty. On the same note, when I died in a boss battle, almost every time their health was still reduced, but I was maxed out with recovery items and full health again. There's a tougher difficulty in New Game Plus, but I think this should have been an option right at the beginning on the first playthrough. That's not to say the combat isn't still fun though. If you're a fan of DMC's combat, you'll feel pretty comfortable here. The actual icon battles are huge spectacles. They give the original God of War trilogy a run for their money on the epic set pieces. But along with that comes some quick time events. But it's a spectacle that actually wowed me a few times. Like most other Final Fantasy games, the gear is minimal. Some basic armor for defense, sword upgrades for attack power, and then accessories have a variety of effects from lowering a skill's cooldown to stat boost to the mentioned auto combat options. This doesn't stray far from the basic gear upgrades in the series. Aesthetically, all that's changing is your sword appearance, and they did add in an alternate outfit before I finished my playthrough, but that's about it. And to start on what I think will actually be the turnoffs for most people about this game. This isn't an open world as you would expect. You have your hub or your base area, where you return to between main story missions and upgrade gear, and pick up the occasional side quest. But the world is sectioned off into zones basically, with only the sections inside of that zone being connected. This really doesn't bug me much, especially in the era of SSDs and minimal load times. What bugged me about these specifically is that the size doesn't meet the amount of activities in these areas. While not being able to run through the hub area I eventually got used to, these big zone areas are just too big for no reason. In a normal RPG, areas like this are fine because there's usually a reason to go explore, be it random encounters, finding some side quests, or finding better gear as rewards. Here there's almost none of that, specifically gear or meaningful loot. Almost every chest or item you find in the field or basic crafting components you'll have an overflow of just from defeating enemies in normal play. In fact, there are only 2 worthy items I remember even picking up organically like that, and one was in the middle of a late game dungeon, so it wasn't even missable. There just isn't anything out there to justify any exploration after the first few hours. It ends up being a pretty linear path disguised in some zones that just have no reason to be as large as they are. Occasionally you'll run into a hunt target in one of these zones, which is a worthy surprise, but those are few and far between since they're usually so tucked away. Speaking of the hunts, let's go back to a positive note. Eventually in your base hub, a Moogle shows up and offers rewards for a questing board showing general locations and info for hunt targets. These are usually elite enemies with required upgrade components or guild rewards, and I thought this was the best side content in the game. As much as I found the basic combat pretty easy, these were more difficult fights in the first playthrough. On the side quest front, I actually had the opposite opinion of most people I've heard talk about this game. A lot of reviews say they got better as you go on, and they do so much more world building later. Almost all of them boil down to a fetch quest or combat mission. But in the beginning, even something as simple as delivering food turned into showing Clive that all the bears that they were fighting to free were all being treated equally. By late game, I just didn't care about the go get this thing and go kill this thing, no matter what side character arc it was trying to close out. Now, I did do all of them because I wanted to make sure I got all the upgraded gear, but the timing on the last set of side missions was just horrible. And I skipped almost all the dialogue just because I was ready to get to the end of the main story and get my closure. And you could be in the camp of enjoying the side quest tie-up storylines at the end. I just wasn't. And then we come to the other main talking point of this game, the cutscenes. I normally wouldn't consider these to be a game mechanic, but here they definitely are. A lot has been said about how often the control is pulled out of the player's hands, and most of it really isn't exaggerated. Your tolerance most likely will come down to how invested you are in the main story. I understand the complexity of the story they were trying to tell here, but I just find the execution so sloppy. Considering the amount of times you'll just fast travel from your hub just to run halfway across the zone map, there definitely should have been some exposition dumps incorporated into these moments instead. I get they were trying to avoid 30-minute cutscenes in the middle of a mission and still wanted to tell their story, but the execution, it's a complete miss here. This could be a huge turnoff to people going into a game that intentionally shifted to more of an action focus just to sit through cutscene after cutscene. If you aren't into the story, your tolerance for this is going to get smaller and smaller the further you go. On the trophy front, for all you trophy hunters out there, I got bad news for you. Though not really a difficult trophy to get, you're going to put in some serious hours here if you're going for a platinum. The majority of the trophies are pretty straightforward for story and gear, and then a couple challenge trophies that aren't too difficult. The main one that's going to bring this down is you have to beat the game on Final Fantasy mode. This is the higher difficulty that unlocks after finishing the game. This is one I know I'll eventually go back and get, since I really enjoyed the game. But if you aren't into the main story, this will be a slog to get through a second time. My playthrough came in somewhere around 50 hours, doing every side quest and hunt, but also skipping a ton of the dialogue and cutscenes for a lot of the side content. So you're probably looking at somewhere between 80 to 90 hours if you streamline it. That's something to keep in mind if you don't think you're going to be into the story here. So let's recap some of the high points, some of the low points, and get to my price point recommendation here. I think most of us have seen it since the first previews. Final Fantasy XVI is a good-looking game. I'm not all about graphics, but I can appreciate a game that has some amazing set pieces.
16 times the detail.
The downfall can come with the excessive particle effects that can make it a bit tough to see what's going on during some of the skill animations. The main characters are all well animated and well acted, but some of the background NPC animations are just wooden. I wouldn't care much about this if it didn't stand out so bad against the main cutscenes you're going to be watching consistently. And about those cutscenes, it's not an exaggeration to say half of my playthrough was cutscenes. While it didn't bug me for most of the mainline story missions, I was really interested in them. But it did ruin the side quests for me at the end of the game. This is going to be the biggest part I think will bore people. It's usually a bad decision to take control away from the player. It just breaks the action so often it's going to annoy a lot of people. The action-focused combat can be really fun, but you're going to get out of it what you put into it, a lot like the DMC games. I understand their intent of approachability, but I feel like this was even at the expense of the normal difficulty being too easy. And all of this could be a negative all around for a traditional turn-based fan. This story grabbed me right away, but this is one of the most subjective points. It gets pretty complex mid-game. It does focus again on endgame, but it also takes a direction some people won't appreciate. There's almost no reward for exploration the way you would expect from the size of some of these individual zones. I won't hate on the lack of gear here, because that's never been a focal point for Final Fantasy games. I really enjoyed the more mature and darker tone the game took. There have been dark moments in stories of previous games, but this one takes a much more mature tone the whole time. While this completely worked for me, it might be off-putting to fans of the franchise, or just general JRPG fans. So where would I recommend picking this up if you were interested? Well, that really depends on a few things, and it basically comes down to how prepared you are for what you're getting here. You're getting a good amount of content here. If you take all the pros and cons into account and are still interested, I would say this game is completely worth the full launch price. Although I had to eat my words about no patch since they released a small optimization patch, this is still 100% a AAA effort and completely worth the price. If you're not a fan of the $70 new releases are going for lately, I see quite a few secondhand for around $40 to $45. And I would say the $40 price point is a steal. Just keep in mind how this game is structured before you throw some money at it. I personally had a great time with it, and think it hit more of the marks with the format changes they were going for than the ones they missed. Let me know down in the comments if you've already played through Final Fantasy XVI and what you thought of it, or if you're still on the fence and waiting for the price to drop a bit more. Until next time.
I said, it's over!
What?
Toodaloo, motherfucker.
Hey,